Hello, everyone. We're going to gather back together for our second series of panels today at a little after 11:15. I am pleased to introduce our panelists on cultures of female monstrosity. We're going to have 3 talks in succession, as you likely saw in the earlier set of the panels, and we'll hold questions until all 3 presentations are complete. Our first speaker is Trung Nguyen. He, she, they is a PhD student in women, gender, and sexuality studies at Oregon State University. They have an MA degree in performance studies and TESOL. Trung's academic and artistic projects center on feminist, queer, and trans subjects in Southeast Asia. Then we'll have Blake Overman. He, they is a PhD student in literature at Indiana University, Bloomington. His scholarly work focuses on monster literature of the long 19th century and its continued resonance in contemporary queer audiences. He is most interested in the effective power of monsters as agents of empathy. Their work often overlaps with intersecting interests such as queer theory, aesthetics, and narratology. And then there is an error in our bio for the next speaker, so thank you for your patience, Ivy. Ivy, they, them, is a philosopher. They love thinking about language and the origin of human thoughts and behaviors. They watch Jordan Peterson and read people's supportive comments when they want to laugh. Their future goals are to be a wealthy writer and good parent. They love food. Please welcome our panelists, and I look forward to your questions for them after we finish the 3 presentations.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Hi, my name is Trung Nguyen. I'm a PhD student at Oregon State University in WGSS, Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. I'm originally from Vietnam, so I self-identify as a third world feminist. And here's my presentation. Mano, why the ghosts in Vietnamese horror films are female. And it was originally like, I was writing the proposal in like a state of delirium. So I was like, I should have used woman. But after, I could change today, in my presentation. But I think after my presentation, maybe you will see why I intentionally leave them as like female. Okay. So the caveat, oh my God. I'm not the best with slides. But so I have 2 caveats for you. First, avoid your Orientalist gaze, because particularly in a panel on, that are named cultures of woman monstrosity, right? Something like that. There might be a tendency to apply, especially in an audience in a Western sphere, there might be a tendency to view it through an Orientalist gaze, despite the fact that, alongside the fact that there are criticism against certain film system and certain representations that is as complicated as, Southeast Asia, where my concentration, my focus is. So avoid your Orientalist gaze. And second is embrace the untranslatability of certain linguistics and cultural differences in non-English speaking film. So there are titles that you might not get within 15 minutes. I don't want to like butcher up with like Vietnamese and English, Vietnamese, English. Embrace it and just, go with the flow, and we'll talk more later. I did well in like framing myself so I received no criticism? No, I'm just kidding. But this is serious caveats. Okay, so a brief history of Vietnamese horror films. I was really excited. Oh my God, why do I like this? So I was really excited to actually like sit down and this is a part of a bigger project for my small part of my dissertation, PhD dissertation in a few years, but I was really excited because I was able to trace, a brief history, which is not a lot, like, since 1975, which is since the end of the resistance movement against the American war, right? So there's not a lot of, capacity, material, supports to like to really blossom the field like here with Hollywood and stuff. But I personally like separate them into three time period. First, pre 1975, like I said, pre war. There's two films that really made the name for itself, but sadly, like only one of them, like Con Ma Nhà Hở, the second one in 1973, really became what is that word? Like the idiom. Like there is an idiom in Vietnamese that's actually copied that the title of that movie, and the first one was not, even though they're both as iconic as each other. And the reason why is because queer phobia, but that's not the topic for today. So the second time period, I would say, is from after 1975 to 2006. So that is the period that witnessed like a really like one of the spearheader for the horror genre in Vietnamese film, by a film producer, a very successful actor named Nguyễn. If you have Vietnamese parents around my parents' age, like 50, 60, he's very, very famous. He's like everybody knows. And it's also very complex because he almost become one of the, for lack of a better term, like a bold people, but he didn't succeed, right? So he was a very complicated figure, but nonetheless, his acting is accepted by the communist state of Vietnam as like, very, very well celebrated. Even though officially he wouldn't get any title because of that complex history. But he was the one who spearheaded the horror film movement in Vietnam, and there's some titles for you. One honorable mention is the film Oan Home, which is Spirits, which was made in 2004 by a Vietnamese American director, Victor Vũ, and it was filmed in Santa Ana. I could have put that film in with the pink period too on there, but I realized I want to frame it with the start of the 2007, when the supposedly, ostensibly, right, movie called 10, which means number 10, The Legend of a Portrait, was made. Because in a lot of film media discourse in Vietnam, 10, The Legend of a Portrait, is actually considered to be the first in the millennium to really, in the new millennium, to really garner attention from like the general public towards this very specific type niche of film in Vietnam. Before that, it was Chen Tin's like success, right? But then it's really died down from around the 1990s to like 2006. It's like really died down because every story kind of became the same. So my focus today will be on the pink one, where technically it could be both the pink and the green one, but because of the scope of time, I focus more on the pink period, right? The 2007 to present, where I look at films that has female ghosts, right? Female ghosts, and technically it's like 90% of them. Like in some capacity, they will have a female ghost, either as the antagonist, or either as the antagonist or like the main thread that kept the story going. And I'm trying to understand why. Why is it always the female ghost? Okay, then we have a brief, introduction about 10, the film. So, in like a little bit cultural background, in Vietnamese family, back in the day, people will usually put the number as the order of the kids they have. So 10 means number 10. So she usually depends on the cultural context, northern or south. She could be the 9th or the 10th kids in the family. The film was co-produced by Vietnam and Korea, directed by director Kim Tae-kyung, and the general plot, without spoiling you, is technically I can frame up with like three main points. First, woman jealousy of each other, either for the same man or for the other one's success, right? And then femicide, and then societal pressure that are one of the motive of this film, right? So the movie garnered a lot of success, and like I said, after that, like, because I also, a kid belong to this generation, so after that, I remember everyone from like high school kids to like, even though it has an age restriction, but you know, so it became a trend, and everyone since that moment, like every year at least during the like the big, you know, every year there will be at least one or two movies that follow these follow the horror genre that specifically one of these three categories, either femicide, societal pressure, or jealousy, right? And the jealousy here is particularly, like, again, like replicate the same mode as Mui, right? It's either with each other because they love the same man, or they, you know, jealous of the other person's success in terms of career. And these are some of the movie. There are more than that, but I picked four that that these themes are the core. With other films, it's become a little bit more implied, but regardless, these three key, you know, assessment, key that I made is pretty prevalent for all the film during that period. So my methodology is I use transnational feminist frameworks. So first I recognize the patterns and ask the question why, you know, 80 to 90% of the storylines in these movies in some way is about a female ghost or vengeful spirit. Why, you know, are the deaths always connected to those three that I just present, like jealousy, societal pressure, and femicide. And also, I want to look at the cultural specificity and locationality of the subject of female ghost, which is Mano, right? Mano is literally word by word translated as female ghost, right? And then lastly, I want to suggest ways to improve the status quo and to perform a kind of reparative reading on these horror films. Okay, so there are three main key points that I you know, separate them in order to answer the why the female ghost question. First, the linguistic aspect. Second, the directorial tendency, and lastly, the censorship, the state censorship. So, Mano, on a linguistic aspect, literally translated a female ghost. It is one of the, you know, it is, so when we say ma something, right, it depends on the word that follow the word ma. It would mean a specific categorization of the ghost itself. So Mano is one of the very popular one. We also have Maya, which is the river ghost, Majoy, which is the spirit orbs in the graveyard, Makarom is vampires, Maman is the drunk spirit ghost, Maja, dark spirits, and then Hui, which is the devil, right? Which the devil spirit, which usually considered to be like more potent than the other ghost. And linguistically, there's no manam. I was like, wow, that's weird. I've never thought about it, but there's no manam, which means there's no male ghost. Of course, that also means there's no non-binary ghost, obviously. And then if the female ghost supposedly has children, or, you know, they then would become me gong ma, which means the mother and child ghost. So they no longer claim the title of Mano, which is kind of also interesting. So this, you know, with this linguistic implication, there could be an explanation why, you know, there's an obsession of overrepresenting like the female ghost in films, because maybe they was just thinking there's no manam, so I don't, we don't really want to like represent that. But let's take a look at the second one. So the second reason was the directorial aspect of the answer. So out of 25, there should be more. I think there should be more than 25. Probably like 25 to 30 Vietnamese horror movies ever made. Only one was made by a female director, and this has been claimed a lot by different media sources, which is the film in 2017 by Dang Thái Huyên. And the majority of these films was made with like the male gaze, of course, with like always tell story of like naive female characters who fall in love with a strong male character, a strong, rough, martial arts leaning, male character. And if not, it's like the typical, Western masculine imagination of masculinity. And then also in some films, there's like redundant sex scenes, especially during the period where a lot of these directors, male director mostly, gazing toward the West, Hollywood, to like really learn how to make movies and how to kind of promote themselves as, special, like as Western trained, and garner their reputation from there. So a lot of redundant sex scenes, and I'm a sex positive person, but still, like some scene, you don't have to put that in there. There's no meaning. And then triangle love interest that involve, that involves two women and the same man. And there is one very important one, but I could not show there. There's no queer storylines at all in all these movies. There's no queer storyline, except for, if you remember, the first one ever, Le Da, right? That I said, that did not become the proverbial Vietnamese phrase, right? Because it's queer coded. So after that movie, none of these films have queer storylines, not even a bit. So then the last way to answer this is about state censorship. So it has been stated by Nguyễn Chen, the famous actor slash film producer I said ago, and then many other successful like Vietnamese director, that the Cục Điện ảnh, the National Department of Films in Vietnam, really restricts horror movie to a few randomly stipulated criteria, which means it's like there's a small group of people, mostly men, would sit down and like, okay, this film have a positive ending, but the other film also have positive ending, but it's too much gore, so like no. And then another film also have too much gore and too many like sex scenes, but if it's propel the agenda of what they deem to be appropriate, then they would pass it. So that's why I say randomly stipulated, even though this is the general expectation that they would have. Not too much violent, gory scenes. Must have positive ending, because if you have, what is that called in English? Like open-ended endings, right? Like where like, boom, the ghost might still be alive. Then they're like, that's not positive. So they would hate it. But they did pass a few, but with a lot of like, trims and cuts that are required to pass, right? And film do not show too much unnecessary sex scene. Film do not encourage too much superstition, and film must not propagate against the communist state. My slide is betraying me today. If you read my proposal, there's a line that I was like, how do I save the Vietnamese ghost? And I was like, I think back about that, and I was like, that was a blow. I shouldn't have said that, because who am I to save the female ghost and to propel myself as a Western trained academics to save who and what, right? So I want to take that back. Please erase that from your memory. I want to say how to perform a reparative reading of Vietnamese horror films. Reparative reading, I'm sort of gesturing toward Eve Sedgwick notion of reparative reading. So where you stay with the text and let the text kind of like guide and think through in sort of like a deconstructed mode. So my reparative reading of this this genre is that, and what I have presented is that there is implicit violence of cis heteropatriarchy on women's body, and its monoscopic representation on films. In 2019, there's a research conducted by the Vietnamese state that 63% of Vietnamese women in marriage reported to have suffered from some sort of violence, either sexual, domestic, or mental violence, etc. And then with what I presented, I hope to diversify storylines that reflects various spiritual and apparitional narratives that are ready to expose in Vietnamese society. Like I said, there's so many other, ghost stories that you could include female character without turning them into a ghost, right? Without telling the same story of how they're killed or how they kill each other, right? So, like there's Maya, Majoy, like I said, like you could explore. And then a call to support women directors. Sadly, the only female directors that made the film in 2017 still makes the same narrative. It's still like, a woman who fall for a man, and then, he cheated on her, and she there's violence on her bodies and things like that. So it's still follow that same motive, which is understandable, because once you're in a mode, like, it takes time to break out. So I do want to call to support for more women director in general, not just in horror genre. I also look at a lot of queer films, and the same thing happened, right? So a lot of male identified directors who does not have the corporeal or cultural or gendered experience to really explore more nuanced story. And then lastly, to alert the disappearing of queerness in Vietnamese horror story, despite the fact that there is the first ever Vietnamese horror film had queer coded, despite its being like, this pervert. Like, there's perversion in their representation of queer story in that movie, but since that movie, no more queer stories. So I want to alert that. And yeah, so that's the sort of small, part of my research and my presentation today. If you have any questions, please reach out to me here. Thank you. And that's the poster of Mui, the first, the one that I described. Thank you.
Hello. Hot. My name is Blake Overman, pronouns he, they. I'm from Indiana University, Bloomington. So very happy to be here in California. I'm a Midwesterner, lifelong Midwesterner. I grew up in Kansas, so I've never seen a coast until yesterday. So it was very exciting to get to move from the middle of the continent to finally get to see beautiful California, and what a pleasure it has been. So I'm really kind of relieved that I have a little extra time today to give us some context on what I'm going to be talking about, as kind of interesting a world it would be if we all knew who Miss Havisham was going into this presentation. Unfortunately, that's not the reality we live in, just as much as we're not all going to be familiar with who Baby Jane Hudson is. So I'll be sure to first kind of ease us into these discussions, and then later, after kind of giving a quick rundown of the novel that we'll be discussing from Charles Dickens, and then Robert Aldrich's cult film, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, giving a quick plot synopsis, just so that we all kind of have a shared foundation. When I mention characters, there hopefully won't be confusion, that sort of thing. And so we can all kind of be on the same page moving forward. So Charles Dickens's Great Expectations is one of his more well-known novels, and that might not say much because Charles Dickens is so kind of ingrained into the Western canon, Western literary canon. It's first published in August 1861, and the plot centers on a young boy, Pip, who is an orphan, and one of the key kind of moments and threads that run through the narrative is this intrigue behind a secret benefactor who is funding the means for him to become a gentleman in Victorian British society. This is like, again, kind of this unknown thread that runs throughout, and one of the potential candidates is the ghostly aged spinster, Miss Havisham. And Miss Havisham is ghostly in many ways. I'll discuss that more in the paper. But just for a quick kind of rundown, she is abandoned on her wedding night, kind of fooled in this kind of ploy by her brother and suspected fiance, but turns out, they're kind of ripping her off for her money because she is an heiress of a brewery. Where she's going to inherit a lot of money, basically, and their goal is to kind of dupe her out of it and ditch her at the altar. Very traumatic event for her. She kind of stagnates in this image of the wedding night. Her house is done up as if the wedding was going to occur. There's a wedding cake on the table that continues to sit there and rot years later. She wears her wedding dress to the day, throughout the entire novel ever since that night, and is even missing a shoe because she throws her shoe at her fiance. So she walks around the house without a shoe on. She is kind of this caricature of, this kind of repressed anger, womanly anger at men who are taking advantage of women, right? While we might want Dickens to kind of be subversive and his treatment of Miss Havisham, I don't think he is. He's very, very heavy-handed with his punishment of that character. And it's one of the key kind of aspects that I want to look at today when talking about kind of transformation of Miss Havisham into Baby Jane Hudson. A few other characters that will come up in my essay, other than Miss Havisham and Pip, is Estella. Estella is Miss Havisham's adoptive daughter, who Miss Havisham is kind of using to manipulate Pip and exact a sort of vengeance, right? Since she can't get directly back at men, she's going to raise a young daughter to basically torment men with her sexuality. So it's this very kind of odd, caricature of early feminism. And I think we can kind of see some parallels there as well. All right. So on to Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, right? As I said, this is a film that has garnered notoriety as a kind of cult film, as a queer film, very, very kind of commonly taken and incorporated into drag iconography, especially the figure of Baby Jane Hudson. So it's released in November 1962, interestingly, about a century later after Great Expectations. I would say that's more coincidental, but just interesting. And it centers on the relationship between two sisters who, interestingly enough, both narratives kind of center on these aged women where sexuality is kind of gone. Or, it's referred to, but in only kind of the past tense. They're no longer seen as sexual objects. Baby Jane, who is played by Bette Davis, the blonde there, even though the film is all black and white, is a former kind of vaudeville star who, through kind of the development of vaudeville into more film, loses kind of traction. She's definitely a star of that moment, but then once that moment has passed, she's forgotten. hence the name Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. Her sister, Blanche, who ironically has like the more darker coloring, right, is kind of emphasized in the black and white film through her black dress, her dark complexion, or her dark hair, is a silent film star, and then later kind of goes into more modern film. And even though she is kind of past her heyday, it continues to kind of show through the narrative in the form of her films beginning to rerun on television, to where she's still receiving royalties and at this point is supporting both herself and her sister in the state. So it's very much centered on that dynamic. I do talk a bit about the plot more in the essay, so I won't kind of reveal my hand too much right now. But just for the sake of being able to discuss these characters, these plots, I thought it would be generative to share these synopses with you. Okay, so let's begin. The fascinations with ghosts has long been a defining characteristic of the literary period of the British long 19th century. Many characters found in Victorian novels who are not literal ghosts adopt ghostly attributes, particularly the specter of the madwoman. Her recurrence in Victorian literature speaks to a stigmatization of womanhood throughout the long 19th century. Madness was used as a tool to contain women. As Jane Mitchell notes in her essay, Reclaiming the Monster, Objection and Subversion in the Marital Gothic, quote, by the mid-19th century, the majority of patients in public lunatic asylums were women. Madness, especially hysteria, came to be known as the female malady, intertwined with the dominant view of the feminine, end quote. Just as these figures haunted the imaginaries of Victorian readers, they continue to terrorize modern audiences by reappearing in contemporary media. The madwoman has endured through continual adaptations of Victorian texts. I, however, am more interested in media that engages what I think of as a repurposing of these literary figures. I use the term repurposing rather than adapting to separate the common associations between novels and adaptation. Rather than building on an existing whole, as adaptation does, repurposing borrows from that whole and forms something that might be considered a palimpsest or inspired by, but is understood as a separate work that fulfills a different purpose. Miss Havisham of Charles Dickens's Great Expectation is a prime example of the Victorian madwoman. Through this figure, the, quote, anxious author articulates for herself the costly destructiveness of anger repressed until it can no longer be contained, end quote. Miss Havisham, unlike other Victorian madwoman characters written by women authors, such as Charlotte Bronte's Bertha Mason, is used by Charles Dickens, a male author, to critique this pent-up womanly anger. Scholarship has long centered on reading her as a monster, an obstacle, that inflicts irreparable emotional damage on Pip and Estella. More recently, however, scholars such as Camilla Nelson and Linda Raphael have shifted towards a more sympathetic view of her character. Clearly, her ghost has not been put to rest, especially for feminist and queer readers and scholars alike. This perception shift in scholarship complements a filmic return of Miss Havisham repurposed into Baby Jane Hudson in Robert Aldrich's 1962 goth/camp film, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. Miss Havisham's possession of Baby Jane manifests through shared iconography, characteristics, and motivations. The key difference in their narratives is the most crucial. Rather than directly adapting Great Expectations and remediating Miss Havisham's character through Baby Jane Hudson, Aldrich repurposes Miss Havisham for a modern audience. And in a crucial difference between the two characters, provide Baby Jane with a direct apology from her tormentor. A critical analysis of the connection between Miss Havisham and Baby Jane Hudson has not previously been established. Miss Havisham is repurposed into a character that is the focus. She finds a queer audience who cheer, sympathize, and even resonate with her. A quick side note, I was taking a class when I first encountered Miss Havisham with my advisor and kind of really, really important person in my life, basically in academia, Dr. Ray Greiner at Indiana University, Bloomington, and it became almost like a class meme that like anytime Miss Havisham came up, people would look over to me. It's like, oh, Blake, like we're talking about Miss Havisham again. It's, it's funny how, of course, I get into this later about queer resonance with Miss Havisham, but how little I feel like I really resonate with the character, but somebody like Miss Havisham comes along who's this like loathsome character who I just like, my person, finally, like a fellow loathsome human being. Anyway, back to it, right? To examine this phenomenon, I will first define what qualities of Miss Havisham are being repurposed through Baby Jane. Next, I wish to bridge both texts by forming connections between Miss Havisham and Baby Jane Hudson concerning their respective text. Similarities such as Gothic influences are prevalent in both, especially regarding the spaces that Miss Havisham and Baby Jane inhabit. Their commonalities extend to theme as well, particularly a shared clutching of the past and an aesthetic of melancholia. After establishing what has been repurposed and justifying the clear relationship between the texts, an analysis of the reception of this act of repurposing, with particular attention paid to how Baby Jane affects queer male audiences, reveals the shaping of Miss Havisham into a camp and therefore inextricably queer icon. Miss Havisham is Dickens' most haunting character. She is, to Pip, quote, the strangest lady I have ever seen or shall see, end quote. Upon first meeting her, she is described as ghastly waxwork and skeletal, amidst already ghostly imagery captured in Miss Havisham and the Gothic estate of Satis House. As the plot unfolds, it is clear that the force that both possesses and animates Miss Havisham are the negative emotions spawned from being a victim of her brother, Arthur, and her ex-fiancé, Compeyson, scheming. To maintain the state of unlife, a temporal and emotional stuckness, she preserves the setting of her trauma. The grotesque scene ensures an unforgettable iconography that haunts the minds of readers and demands their attention. Miss Havisham is undoubtedly, even beyond the eyes of young Pip, meant to be understood as a monstrous woman. For just as Pip, and therefore the audience, is haunted by the image of Miss Havisham, an adult Arthur Havisham, her brother, is also haunted by her through a nightmarish manifestation, where he says, she's all in white, with flowers in her hair, and she's awful mad. It is no surprise that part of what would manifest in a repurposing of the character would inherit both her monstrosity and her grotesque, melancholic aesthetics. Existing scholarship, as well as a handful of modern adaptations of Great Expectations, have complicated the reception of Miss Havisham as a character. She has shifted from being read by scholars such as Kurt Hartog in their 1982 article, The Rape of Miss Havisham, as a parody of motherhood, to the contemporary assertion by Camilla Nelson that Miss Havisham had every right to be mad. Rather than being seen purely for her villainy, there is an interest in analyzing the causation as well as the symptoms of Miss Havisham's madness. Her eventual remorse for the circular trauma she inflicts on Estella and Pip warrants some sympathy for her. However, by the end, her anger and rage switch to perpetual grief. Her punishment via fiery exorcism, yes, she is caught ablaze by her own fireplace. Through her taking of accountability and literal immolation, leaves her alive but in a catatonic state and severely burned. Rather than succumbing to her wounds, she dies from the nervous shock. Miss Havisham's suffering is ultimately tertiary to Pip's narrative, however. During her apology, Miss Havisham laments her wrongdoings towards Pip and Estella. During her apology, I already said that. Specifically how she, quote, meant to save Estella from misery, end quote, to prevent a possible replication of her own suffering. Miss Havisham pleads to Pip, quote, if you knew all my story, you would have some compassion for me and a better understanding of me, end quote. And though he insists he does, truthfully, he does not. Miss Havisham provides Pip with the apology that she was not given. Yes, the trauma has already been inflicted, but the reader can imagine the ambiguous ending of the novel implies that hope is not all lost for Pip. Pip saving her from immolation does not absolve him or her continual haunting of his mind, demonstrated when he is, quote, awakened by Miss Havisham's cries and by her running at me with all that height of fire above her head. This pain of the mind was much harder to strive against than any bodily pain I suffered, end quote. It does, however, bring attention to the causation of both Miss Havisham and Pip's suffering, the actions of others. The deception of Miss Havisham by Compeyson and her brother has created this monster and victimized Pip and Estella as a result. Having the ability to absolve oneself from the trauma inflicted by others is the lesson. Pip's ability to do so affords him an ambivalent ending as opposed to the painful one given to Miss Havisham. This lesson, however, proffers a fairly pessimistic approach or perspective that apologies are utterly meaningless since emotional strife endures. Whatever Happened to Baby Jane reevaluates Dickens's sentiment towards apologies by demonstrating that the incredible power of apologizing and taking accountability can have in easing the suffering of those who are wronged. Miss Havisham's character that is being repurposed through Baby Jane is just one part of understanding the ways that Whatever Happened to Baby Jane envisions a different outcome for the aged madwoman. The similarities between these two characters are vast and can fill an entire paper on themselves. So in the restraints of this presentation, I will instead focus on analyzing the three primary areas of the overlap between Miss Havisham and Baby Jane Hudson: their aesthetics, their characteristics, and their affective influence. Baby Jane's performance as a child vaudeville star establishes her Shirley Temple-like aesthetic that is preserved in the uncanny life-size Baby Jane Hudson doll. Her performance of the song I've Written a Letter to Daddy becomes a leitmotif throughout the film, becoming increasingly more erratic as Baby Jane's own mental health state worsens. Much like Miss Havisham's thwarted wedding, this scene becomes an obsessive episode in the mind of Baby Jane that she impossibly seeks to replicate. The attempts at replication of this episode become grotesque in the eyes of the audience, both diegetic and non-diegetic. Specifically, her attempts at replicating her days as a child starlet forms what contemporary film critic Peter Bradshaw described as, quote, the hideous Baby Jane Hudson, played in full Miss Havisham regalia, end quote. Drawing a direct comparison to Dickens's character that highlights the resonance between the two. The audience is introduced to the melancholic, aged Baby Jane, donning a haggardly sad clown face, as you can see here. Her hair is frayed at the roots and ends in loose curls that were once glistening and crisp. The dual images of the child starlet and the aged woman emphasize Baby Jane as abject, or as Williams describes it, quote, beautiful/ugly, with her grotesque appearance and murder and mayhem notwithstanding, becoming one of the film's most sympathetic characters, end quote. This grotesqueness is also associated with her trauma that has continued to haunt her through aging and explains her yearning for the pre-trauma state of her childhood. The melancholia that is so crucial to both characters is key to the camp aesthetic and iconography of Baby Jane. It would be ignorant to exclude the casting choice of Bette Davis to play the character, an actress with a reputation for playing abject women, punctuated by a distinctively dramatic approach to performance that complements the film's camp. The simultaneous excessive and grotesque aesthetic of Baby Jane contributes to the larger repurposing of Miss Havisham into a camp icon. As I will discuss later, it enables the character to find an audience that commiserates with her and resonates with her. The dynamics of Baby Jane's narrative are inverted, and in that inversion is a crucial component of her repurposing. We have a more direct and unfiltered view of Baby Jane and Blanche's backstory, however. However, the exception is the traumatic event that leads to Blanche's paraplegia. The camera conceals the identities of the attacker and the victim. This concealment of the full scene works similarly to the mystery surrounding Miss Havisham's haunting character and presence throughout the novel. It's not something that we know right off the bat. Just as the men and Pip himself impart monstrosity onto Miss Havisham, the diegetic male audience, the many groups of men who comment on Baby Jane throughout the film, do similar work in shaping the non-diegetic viewer's construction of the traumatic scene, placing the monster, Baby Jane, in the driver's seat without knowing the full picture themselves. The car crash is Baby Jane's equivalent to the botched marriage, and is a similar betrayal on a sibling's part as Miss Havisham's. The commonality between characters is once again obvious. Rather than initial rage being the motivation behind Baby Jane's madness, it's overwhelming guilt. So we see a kind of inversion there. Where rage becomes guilt in Miss Havisham, guilt becomes rage in Baby Jane. The mere mention of the crash by Blanche causes the bombastic Baby Jane to either retreat or lash out. Her guilt, just like Miss Havisham's rage, leads her to take on a caretaker role that her trauma corrupts. The isolation that becomes with her continued role as primary caretaker for Blanche forms a bitterness that continually devolves into psychopathy until reaching complete psychosis at the closing of the film. This psychological nosedive is prompted by Blanche's films being played on television and the subsequent attention she garners, a reminder of Blanche's success as a film actress and Baby Jane's failure to maintain the glory of her vaudeville days. A time that allowed for the Hudson family to flourish and set the foundation for Blanche's successful career. Baby Jane's rage stems from being unseen, unheard, and feeling unappreciated. Miss Havisham is never allowed to tell the story of her trauma. She is only allowed by the text to express the remorse that defines her character after her apology and forgiveness of Pip. Miss Havisham's yearning for Pip to commiserate with her is predicated on her understanding her story. Pip's insistence that he does feel for Miss Havisham and that he has heard her story deprives a cathartic release expected of a denouement. The story he has heard did not come from her, but filtered through a male perspective and rumor, similar to the male chorus of whatever happened to Baby Jane. Miss Havisham gives Pip what she was never given, an apology. Dickens perpetuates her suffering through her atonement. Even though she takes accountability and faces retribution, her past actions do not warrant her to survive or be granted a peaceful death. What Baby Jane is given that Miss Havisham was denied is an expression of remorse directly from the mouth of the one who damned her to a lifetime of suffering, an emotional institutionalization. Blanche taking accountability is cataclysmic. It is the culmination of repurposing of the Miss Havisham subplot into the film, a cathartic denouement that finally reveals the full picture of the scene that was previously cropped. It speaks to the ways that the filtered view of Miss Havisham was unjust to her character. While it does not absolve either character of their crimes, what it does do is establish sympathy for the causation of their villainy. Blanche takes responsibility for suffering and ruination of her sister, and in turn becomes an accomplice to her suffering, to the murder of her housekeeper and friend Elvira, and the abuse and trauma of her sister by the police because of her silence. Baby Jane, who is in a state of childlike psychosis when Blanche delivers her apology, offers a glimpse of what could have been, as Blanche confesses to setting up the crash to make it look as if Baby Jane had rammed the car into Blanche. Blanche asks, quote, "You mean all this time we could have been friends," end quote, gesturing to an alternative reality where the tragedies in the plot did not occur. Even though Baby Jane's crimes ensure that she will be incarcerated or institutionalized, it is at this point that we truly commiserate with Baby Jane. The veil of her monstrosity is momentarily dispelled, and her feelings become human, rather than being perceived as the byproduct of madness. Whatever happened to Baby Jane remains a cult staple for queer audiences. As Bruce Williams explains, it has been incorporated into queer culture since the film's initial release. What I argue as a repurposing of Miss Havisham allows Baby Jane Hudson to find an audience that resonates with her. Though Miss Havisham was not afforded an apology, the act that was shown in Baby Jane was a form of exorcism. Through Baby Jane Hudson, the audience can fantasize about what an apology to the loathly, abject Miss Havisham could achieve. My reading of Baby Jane as performing a simplified version of Miss Havisham reveals a critique at the center of whatever happened to Baby Jane that extends beyond the glamour and excess associated with ideal femininity. It displays the power of an apology to identities that feel scorned, suppressed, and unseen. Baby Jane's bitterness for feeling imprisoned by her role as her sister's caretaker, as well as the consistent blurring of the youth/agedness of her character, speaks to a personal grief of a life that could have been lived in different circumstances. Her dreams of a different reality amidst this containment go beyond just relating to a queer audience via camp. The film resonates with queer audiences because of a shared feeling of sexual deprivation or being made a monster, particularly within the context of the decade that this film was released, the quote-unquote swinging 60s, a period of sexual enlightenment that was not openly accessible to these identities. Camp in Baby Jane illumes a queer reading of Miss Havisham. Though individuals with queer sexualities will, like Miss Havisham, never receive an apology for the suffering and loss inflicted by a heteronormative culture, through Baby Jane, the fantasy of an apology is possible. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ivy. I'm an undergrad here, a philosophy student. And my presentation is on the feminine monstrosity in Chinese societies. I'm from China. I'm a Chinese immigrant. I immigrated to San Francisco when I was 13. So ever since, I have been exposed to a universality that is not my own. When I was taking monster studies at college, we were learning about different monsters from different books in the West, and I just realized that there is really a gap between my experience and the knowledge that I have access to here. So this is my attempt to fill in that gap. I would like to start with a quote. It is not the bodily differences between the sexes, after all, that lie at the heart of the castration threat within the psychoanalytic schema, but rather the fear that through the loss of the phallus, the differences between men and women can be erased, rendering them similar to one another. In 2021, the National Committee of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference released a proposal on preventing the feminization of male youth. Si Zefu, the proposer, observes that the male youth in today's China possess qualities like delicacy, low self-esteem, and timidity. They pursue the little fresh meat, 小鲜肉, style of creamy boys, which just means an aesthetics in Chinese male celebrities that is sentimental and delicate instead of macho, like flower boys in the West. He calls this the feminization of male adolescent. He believes if the trend of Chinese male youth feminization does not receive effective correction, it would harm the survival and development of the Chinese society. The term little fresh meat is used as a compliment in daily discourses, as the taste of females in China undergoes a generational change to favor men who look harmless and sweet. The nationwide reactionary proposal then aims to correct this domination of, quote, femininity as the social aesthetics. The proposal not only posits femininity as shameful and prohibited, it essentializes femininity to be inferior and undesirable, delicacy, low self-esteem, and timidity. Femininity is monsterized on the societal level. It's a quality that one shouldn't have. The character for mother in Chinese, Niang, shown here, is often used as a pejorative to shame individuals of all genders for possessing stereotypically feminine traits. This paper talks about the monsterization of femininity through the lens of early Chinese literature and its representation of female monsters. My intention of choosing early literary works which explicitly exhibit misogyny as materials for analysis is to demonstrate how normalized and alive these patriarchal ideologies still are in the society. There's a pattern of stories from early Chinese writing on the beauty of women as seductive and harmful. The Tale of White Snake is a famous folk tale in China that has preserved its cultural relevance for hundreds of years. 西湖三塔记, journaling 3 towers in the West Lake, is a possible origin of the folktale. This version of the folktale, written in the Song Dynasty, differs vastly from its modern adaptation on its portrayal of the monster's femininity. And a deeper look into the short story suggests the author's use of imagined traits of monsters that are otherwise impossible to find in humans as warnings against human female individuals in real life. The story goes, a man, Swensen, passes by a luxurious palace that belongs to the beautiful white-clothed woman, who is the monster character. Swensen sees her feasting on the heart of her past lover. As her lover dies, the woman immediately asks Swensen to be her husband, initiates in sexual relations with him, and detains him after his several attempts to escape. In the end, Swensen is saved by his uncle, a man with higher magical power, who kept the white-clothed woman and her 2 servants imprisoned in a jar. They return to their real forms as a raven and frogs. Throughout the story, the monster's cannibalism and malintent are supposed to warn men from the seduction of feminine sexuality. The character of the white-clothed woman is designed to be breaking the social constraints on women at the time in the Song Dynasty. As a female, she enjoys and seeks out sexual opportunities. She enjoys the masculine privilege of sexual and marital freedom and has enough magical powers to independently sustain a good life. All of these traits, which are harmless if not positive, shouldn't be warned against since they don't have anything to do with her cannibalism nor immorality. It is a curious choice, then, on the writer's part, to include them into the body of a monster. Her beauty, which should be pleasant, is coded with a negative social connotation. It is written and understood to be a tool that lures men into a dangerous cave where she feasts on their hearts. This invites us to wonder why the monster's desirable traits have to be so closely associated with traits that are harmful and deadly. Why is this fear written into the story? To answer that, it is crucial to first look at the political environment in the Song Dynasty that shaped the concept of femininity. In the paper Crime and Transgression, a study on the female groups with negative images in Song Dynasty, Trung discusses the 5 categories of women in the Song Dynasty whose actions gave them a negative image, which are jealous, fierce, promiscuous, toxic, and monstrous. The society at the time when the story was written was one that essentialized the biological and sexual differences between males and females, and punished women for traits that were deemed intrinsic, natural, and essential to them. These 5 negative images in women helped to maintain the patriarchal system at the time. They include women who resisted male polygamy and arranged marriage as a marital structure, who challenge the inferior and compliant familial role given to women, practice magic and witchcraft, or try to get rid of their husbands after falling in love with someone else. The white-clothed woman's traits are challenging the social norms for women at the time, and the desirability of what's condemned by society reveals the fragility of the societal structure. The white snake is, quote, that which questions binary thinking and introduces a crisis, end quote. Men didn't know what to do with the desire they had for a monster, and the fear comes from their unwillingness to turn into a monster too. However, it is not because someone is a monster that desiring them would be scary. Instead, when a desire is taboo, the fear of being socially outcasted leads to the monsterization of the subject of desire. Taking humanity from the subject of desire simultaneously justifies however the man behaves, because it is the monster who is bad for harming people by seducing them. The monstrosity being talked about in this research is one that is feminine, where femininity is defined as all of which deviates from the masculinity defined by the patriarchy. And this definition of femininity allows for the inclusion of male individuals who do not fit into the conventional masculine expectations, however masculinity imagines a man to be in terms of sexual expression, ethnicity, or class. Plenty of literature and social phenomena reflect the coexisting and intertwined nature of monstrosity and femininity. When a monster appears, it is expected to be feminine, and what is feminine is, in a sense, monstrous. In the realm of social consciousness, monstrosity and femininity are an inseparable pair where people assume the presence of one with the emergence of the other. Journey to the West is one of the 4 Chinese literary classics. It talks about the journey of a monk and his 3 apprentices, one of which is the Monkey King, and the monsters they encounter throughout the journey. One of the most famous stories in the book is the 3 beatings on the white-bone spirit, where the monster is a female corpse that has turned into skeletons. She's called the white-bone spirit or Mrs. Whitebone. In the story, Whitebone wanted the sacred meat of the monk in order to become immortal and youthful. She deceived the monk 3 times by turning into a beautiful woman, an old man, and lastly, a beautiful woman, an old woman, and lastly, an old man. She got exposed and beaten by the Monkey King each time, but kept coming back with a new form until the Monkey King defeated her. One thing to stress about this story is that the monster is written, and in the general discourses to this day, understood to be female. Her name, White-Bone Spirit, is now used to refer to women who are too bony. This female identity is created and emphasized in the monster, even though the intentions and magic abilities of the monsters are agender. This paper argues that what makes a monster feminine, what femininity is essentially used to mean, is the quality of achieving one's desires and goals the improper way, with deception and trickery, instead of using proper intellect, power, or brute force. Whitebone has to be female because shape-shifting, deception is improper, it is feminine. In other words, it deviates from what is properly masculine in the patriarchy. Shape-shifting and deception are the admittance of one's inability to confront an obstacle properly. The proper masculine demonstration of reaching one's goals is the Monkey King's reaction towards Whitebone. In spite of the monk's scolding and punishment of his violence, he relentlessly attempts to beat Whitebone to death each time he sees her. And it might be clear already to some of the audience that the standards for what is considered proper or not is arbitrary. There's no evaluative list of traits that apply to female and male monsters equally. What is seen as strength and courage in male magical creatures could be called inhumane and monstrous violence in females. the morally inferior exploitation of one's power. And what is deemed scheming and calculating in females could be wittiness and strategic skills in males. This is what we normally call double standards. But there's another layer to this phenomenon. It is not just that the society is harsh and unfair to the group of females, but that the very concept of femininity is used under the patriarchy as a container of traits that the patriarchy marginalizes. Whatever is improper is feminine: delicacy, low self-esteem, timidity. Traits that could occur in anyone, traits that should be prevented, traits that could occur in anyone are in fact bad. They should be prevented because of their femininity, according to the proposal. Having a low self-esteem is harmful to a male child, not for their psychological well-being, but because he's being feminized. So in this way, the 2021 proposal that I just mentioned earlier is not on preventing harmful ideologies or mentalities. It is feminization that should be prevented. More crucially, the femininity being talked about here isn't only undesirable in men, but also in women. In this ideological system, masculinity and femininity aren't qualities that should just separately and accordingly fit into men and women, and then all is well. Unlike masculinity to men, femininity does not make a woman whole. It is essential and natural to them, but in this system, it is also the monster in them. In the previous section, I wrote about what made the feminine traits of the monster monstrous. However, as I continued my research, I read more and more literature featuring female monsters that follow the same pattern. A beautiful woman takes out the heart of a male victim of her love, and she is revealed to be an ugly monster. This repetition made me wonder why monsters with these particular behaviors and traits have to be female monsters. What makes monstrosity feminine? In the story Painted Skin, the monster, disguised as a beautiful woman, in the story Painted Skin, the monster, disguised as a beautiful young woman, meets Wang Sheng, the protagonist. Wang Sheng, the man, is aroused by the woman's beauty and takes her home. He was warned by his wife and a Taoist monk about the woman, but he dismissed them as he struggled to believe that danger could come from the pretty woman. Later, he catches the woman in her real form, quote, an evil monster, green face, saw-like teeth, holding a brush to paint on a piece of human skin. Then it wore the skin and became the woman. The monster takes out Wang's heart, leaving the wife helpless and miserable. The monster's femininity isn't about the quality of femininity existing in monsters, or how monsters possess feminine traits, but rather is about how monsters' traits are essentialized biologically and sexually to be female. Monstrosity and femininity define each other. The, quote, femininity that is condemned by the need to escape from society isn't beauty, but it's the wicked, deceitful, cannibalistic, ugly monster that people expect to be hidden in a beautiful woman. That is why Whitebone is a female monster. Reaching one's goals through trickery and deceit is a female trait. Only fighting for it with force and strength is properly masculine. This is why the Whitebone spirit, the monster wearing a painted skin, and a white-clothed woman can be beautiful in their original, real form. The monster has to be undesirable and appalling in their true form to prove that they have been the one who is deceitful and at fault. In other words, if the monsters are beautiful in their real form, then it isn't the case that they wore their beauty with motives, that they attempted to seduce the men. Then it is totally the man's doing that they were aroused. What's more, then they weren't trying to use seduction to get what they want. They aren't deceitful, but are reaching their goals the proper way. And this, threatens the very foundation of the patriarchy. This erases the sexual and biological differences that the patriarchy has imagined and put onto individuals to reassure the rigidity of the patriarchal structure. The feminine monstrosity is comforting. It's a pacifier for men, the opioid that upkeeps the patriarchy by blinding masses from its contradictions and illogic. And this isn't just an abstract concept that only impacts the worlds in literature. This is a very real cultural phenomenon happening. The proposal to prevent male feminization assumes and projects undesirable traits to femininity. Even when it so clearly equates femininity to be traits that are mentally unhealthy, it sees no reason for women to avoid having these traits. This is the prevention of feminization in males. The monster in men needs to be driven out, but the monster in women is natural to them. And a lot of these explicit sexist ideologies in China actually face a lot of opposition from a very loud and rising group of feminists in China. The proposal to prevent feminization became very controversial as it went viral. And some people questioned the assumption that femininity is inherently bad and shameful. But I want to show with my work that that is not enough. The very sexist proposal or the usage of the character mother to shame femininity, these are the very real manifestation of something that we all accept, the feminine monstrosity. I want to show with my work that monsters are not merely creatures in literature and films that have no impact on our lives. They're not something that we should see as only entertainment. They define normality. They determine who gets to be proud of who they are and who has to hide their monstrosity. And these stories are still being read without the awareness of how they monsterize femininity, how the acceptance of these stories is the very cause of the proposal to prevent feminization. And I want to end this presentation with a quote by Frantz Fanon from his book, Black Skin, White Mask. It very well demonstrates the problem with these inexplicit forces of oppression that normalize the inferiority of a group that we often don't see. To speak gobbledygook to a black man is insulting, for it means he's the gook. Yet, we'll be told there's no intention to willfully give offense. Okay, but it is precisely this absence of will, this offhand manner, this casualness, and the ease with which they classify him, imprison him at an uncivilized and primitive level, that is insulting. Thank you.
This is for Ivy. You're pointing out, of course, contemporary government things and, the story thing. What about Confucianism and Buddhism, especially, male withdrawal from the world and other things like that? Are those not things that are fundamentally involved in this larger narrative and pattern, and also, are fundamental to White Snake? Because you got to get the guys away from the girls, or things like that. And it's an all-male society, which of course is a homosexual society too, but we'll put that aside for the moment.
How do I use this? Hello? Yeah. Yes, of course, I think that these confusion or these really fundamental philosophical ideas that govern the Chinese society play a role in oppressing women. But I think I just want to point out these things in more early literary works that people don't usually recognize in China, because these stories I talked about, they're really, really well known and influential, And Journey to the West is a book that kids in China all read, and the story, The White Bone Spirit, is a really beloved story. And I think I really want to show with my research that even though these stories, like maybe in isolation, you can't really tell that they're being sexist, like how they're monsterizing femininity, but like as a whole, the fact that there's this constant repetition of how femininity is portrayed, that is something that is normalized and recognized in Chinese society, I think, when talking about literature or like when choosing what books for children to read. And yeah, and I just think that that's very powerful in how it shapes the society. And that's just what I want to show with my research.
Hi, thank you all for this terrific panel. This is a question for all of you. I was struck by the way these different accounts of femininity turn on temporality. So Blake, talking about Miss Havisham, there's this kind of stasis that is definitive, right, of the not just the monstrosity of femininity, but the passivity of femininity. And the same thing happens with Baby Jane. And Trung, you're talking about ghosting and about returns and about a certain kind of inherent iterability, repetition of ideas of femininity. And I think this is also coming up in the actual stories that you're working with, Ivy, where there is this essence of femininity, but it's something that gets embedded into a plot and becomes a plot device that turns the story, that makes it happen. So I'm wondering if you all could reflect on the relationship between femininity, monstrosity, and temporality. And we know something about this from like queer readings, and No Futures and things like that. But it strikes me that each of your archives is opening up a way to think about time and monstrosity and femininity that I want to hear more about.
Yeah, if it's okay, I'll go ahead and answer first, just because I'm worried I'll lose it. I did think that there was an interesting kind of overlap, especially with Ivy's presentation and kind of the stuckness that women and feminine identities feel, just because of how paradoxical the expectations are for them. I think, just as much as Ivy's presentation started off with timidity and kind of passiveness is villainized in everybody, so too is this kind of transgressiveness of that, where like being a sexually like predatory female or feminine person is just as bad as being timid. So it's like, what is it, in the ways, I think Ivy was pointing out just how patriarchal these kind of confines of femininity can become, mainly to contain. And I think in the same way, it relates to the containment that is not only this temporal containment, but even the contemporary containment of women in asylums in Victorian England. I think that there's this kind of, at least with my archive, this kind of idea of, just get over it, move on. That I think if that was the case, we wouldn't be here. Talking about this, talking about female monstrosity today, and I think just as much as, we're seeking to kind of rationalize the way that we've been contained, feminine identities have been, I think it's works like Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, where, part of the pleasure of that is, again, the kind of apology and ability to move on because there is a recognition of how unfair femininity has been treated.
I think for me, I did not think much about temporality because the way that Vietnamese think about time reflected in the language itself. We don't care so much about past tense. We don't have tenses, and the same goes for a lot of Native American languages. where time, due to my limited knowledge, but I do know that there are languages that don't say tomorrow as tomorrow, but sometimes it's like today plus one, for example. So I don't think much about temporality, but once the question is asked, I think it is indeed like, the string of events that I presented, right? Where like from 2007 to now, nothing escapes that form of monstrosity. But that is only in film. So in horror film specifically, in other aspects, there are other complex feminist analysis. But within that same notion, since temporality was brought up, I also want to say like spatiality, right? Where I don't think we can separate temporality and spatiality, because while the naive, let's say Asian Vietnamese female body is viewed at kind of like needs protection and at time turn into ghost. In that specific context, is read as that. But like, if you place it to a Western, context, that might be read differently. That might be read as like, that's the submission to patriarchy, or whatnot. Because I've been to enough spaces that I know that they would be read differently. So to complicate the question, I would also add like spatiality, where it is presented, and who celebrated or like who written it is also another part of it. I hope I answered the question.
I also didn't think much about temporality when I was doing my research. I think my intention of choosing to analyze earlier literary works is to really show that these monster characters that are written with really explicit misogynistic intentions, like even though that as a reader in China, you might think that that is very far away from our society now, I still think that they're very much alive. Just when the proposal to prevent the feminization of male youth was released, a lot of people were very shocked that this is what is being seen on a national level. But I don't think they should be, because there are still a lot of invisible oppressive forces that live in our society, and I think they're actually much worse than really, really explicit sexism, because like these forces actually come to define what normality is. Because of their seemingly invisibility, because of how insignificant they seem to be, they really have come to define our social consciousness and people's identities and the treatments that they get. So like my point is just to show that these works that seem very backwards are actually still present in the society.
Can I ask a question? I have the microphone. My question is for Blake. I love the framework of repurposing instead of adaptation, and the ways that opens up the way we think about characters moving across time, or characters being sort of reimagined or kind of received quite differently across time. And so one of the things that I was thinking about, especially when you said that Miss Havisham is the most haunting character of Dickens, or which I 100% agree with, is to try to think about what it is about the creation of characters that kind of allows them to to be available for repurposing. And so, when you were talking about Miss Havisham and, the question of whether or not Dickens is sympathetic to her or, really sort of nasty to her in the creation and, the ways in which she's been recuperated by various contemporary critics as, as a kind of feminist icon or as somebody who deserves sympathy versus the kind of like earlier versions. But the thing that made me think about most is that, whatever Dickens might have thought about Miss Havisham, she is one of the most complexly formed characters, certainly in Great Expectations and, across his novels as a whole. I mean, he is so incredibly detailed in the attention that he pays to her and in the ways in which he constructs this character that's unlike any other character that you find in 19th century literature. So I'm just wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit more about just about the ways in which kind of Miss Havisham or any other characters that you might be interested in are kind of like what makes them available for the repurposing that you're thinking about.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. I think that Miss Havisham specifically, as you said, is somebody who's treated with so much attention, and just as much as Pip has this kind of thread of intrigue about who his benefactor is or benefactress is, so too is there this thread of kind of the myth of Miss Havisham and who she is and how she became the kind of ghostly figure she is today. One of the things that I think opens her up for this repurposing is, again, that feeling that justice wasn't done. And I think so much of Dickens' treatment of her is this kind of notion of it doesn't matter that she had all these things happen to her, she should have moved on and not, inflicted this pain. She should have fulfilled her role as a woman, as a mother. Motherhood is something that is very much critiqued in Great Expectations, not only through Miss Havisham, but Mrs. Joe as well, who is murdered in a very, very traumatic way. Dickens, it's, Great Expectations, he's very cruel to women in that. Even Estella has like a miserable ending. And so I feel like the Miss Havisham and other Victorian madwomen like Bertha Mason, there's this feeling of they were treated unfairly in their texts, and I think it's what has made them so readily kind of drawn upon when it comes to repurposing. I mean, I talked about Miss Havisham and Baby Jane Hudson today, but Bertha Mason and Wyatt Sargasso Sea by Jane Reese is another kind of example of this dissatisfaction with the treatment of the character. And this kind of feeling that, no, she wasn't 100% wrong, and I feel like that's kind of what we're revisiting, is that. Thank you.
Oh, well, mine is very simple, and it's for Trung. You listed a bunch of sorts of Vietnamese ghosts, the river ghosts and the drunken ghosts and the graveyard orbs and all that sort of thing. Are all of those considered to be male by default, or are they sort of genderless, if you see what I mean?
Yeah, thank you. So they are usually like genderless, but like the drunk ghost, you could guess it's the male, like supposedly. So it's never be explicit because, and it's interesting because like it's never explicitly like, because to Vietnamese people, like they're like if they become ghosts, they're these type of ghosts that I listed, and not the ghost of, there's another category of like ghost of ancestor, which is the Vietnamese practice, right? So those are the human ghost. We're treated with more respect because they are the human ghost, the one that belongs to the ancestor. But with the ghosts that turn into like the nuisance for the community, it's usually like genderless. But of course, within the imaginations of cis hetero patriarchal society, like a drunken ghost could not be a woman, but nobody care about what gender they are. But when it comes to like Manu, right, everybody suddenly cares, like that she's a woman and she has long hair and wearing white dresses, right? And so yeah, I think that's the case.
Thank you very much.
Instructed to walk to the mic. Please give a round of applause to our panelists.